The morning of August 9th, 1969, started like any other beautiful California day in Beverly Hills. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and Winifred Chapman was heading to work at 1050 Cielo Drive, completely unaware that she was about to discover one of the most horrific crime scenes in American history. Chapman had been the housekeeper for Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski for over a year. She knew their routines, their habits, their friends. Sharon was 8 months pregnant and glowing with expectation. Roman was in London filming, leaving his young wife in their secluded hillside home with friends for company. It was supposed to be safe. It was supposed to be paradise. But when Chapman arrived at 8:30 a.m. and saw the white Rambler parked askew in the driveway, something felt wrong. The car belonged to Stephen Parent, an 18-year-old kid who sometimes visited the caretaker. What was he still doing here? Why hadn't he left the night before? Then she saw the blood, first, just spots on the white car, then more blood on the walkway. Chapman's heart began racing as she approached the front door of the main house. The word pig was scrawled across it in what looked like dark red paint. But Chapman knew it wasn't paint. The metallic smell in the air told her exactly what it was. Her screams shattered the morning silence of the exclusive neighborhood. "There are bodies everywhere," she sobbed into the phone to police dispatchers. "Oh God, there's so much blood." What Chapman had discovered would haunt America for decades. Inside the house, Sharon Tate lay in the living room, her body connected by a rope around her neck to Jay Sebring, the celebrity hairstylist who had been her former boyfriend. Both had been stabbed multiple times. Outside by the pool, Abigail Folger, heiress to the coffee fortune, and her boyfriend Wojciech Frykowski lay dead, their bodies showing signs of a desperate struggle for survival. And in that white Rambler, slumped over the steering wheel with 4 bullet wounds, was Stephen Parent. He'd simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, trying to leave when the killers arrived. The crime scene was unlike anything Beverly Hills police had ever encountered. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. Expensive items were left untouched. This wasn't a crime of passion targeting one person. 5 people had been systematically slaughtered. The sheer brutality was staggering. 102 stab wounds total across all victims. Sharon Tate alone had been stabbed 16 times. Within hours, news trucks lined the narrow canyon road. Reporters pressed against police barriers, desperate for information about Hollywood's most shocking tragedy. The beautiful people of Beverly Hills locked their doors for the first time in years. If it could happen to Sharon Tate, young, wealthy, protected by gates and security systems, it could happen to anyone. Roman Polanski flew back from London in a private jet, his world destroyed. The baby he would never meet had died with Sharon. The life they'd built together was gone in one night of unimaginable violence. At the airport, photographers captured his anguish as he learned the gruesome details. His wife hadn't just been killed, she'd been butchered. But the killers weren't finished. As police processed the Cielo Drive scene, they had no idea that another nightmare was about to unfold just 15 miles away in Los Feliz. The monsters who had destroyed Sharon Tate's world were already planning their next attack. The age of innocence was over. The summer of love had ended in blood. And somewhere in the hills of Los Angeles, a madman named Charles Manson was smiling. The Beverly Hills Police Department had never handled anything like this. 5 bodies, over 100 stab wounds, a crime scene that looked like a slaughterhouse. Detective Lieutenant Robert Helder took charge of the investigation, but even seasoned cops were throwing up at the sight of what had been done to the victims. The first suspect was obvious: William Garretson, the 19-year-old caretaker who lived in the guest house behind the main residence. How could he have slept through a massacre? How could he not have heard screaming, gunshots, the sounds of people dying just yards from his door? It seemed impossible, but Garretson passed multiple lie detector tests. His story never changed. He'd been listening to music with headphones, smoking marijuana, and somehow missed the entire horrific event. Roman Polanski became the next focus of suspicion. His marriage to Sharon had been troubled, filled with affairs and wild parties. He'd made enemies in Hollywood with his arrogant attitude and controversial films. Police spent weeks investigating his finances, his relationships, his whereabouts. But his alibi was ironclad. He'd been in London, photographed at restaurants and meetings throughout the night of the murders. The drug angle seemed promising at first. Wojciech Frykowski was known to deal small amounts of MDA and other psychedelics to Hollywood's elite. Maybe this was a drug deal gone catastrophically wrong. Police raided suspected dealers throughout Los Angeles, interrogated known users, followed every lead into the underground drug culture. But nothing connected. The violence was too extreme, too personal for a simple drug dispute. Then there was the Black Panther theory. The word pig, written in blood, suggested possible political motivation. This was 1969. Racial tensions were exploding across America. Some investigators became convinced that radical Black Panthers had targeted wealthy white celebrities as symbols of oppression. They spent months pursuing this theory, harassing innocent activists and completely missing the real killers. Sharon's father, Colonel Paul Tate, conducted his own investigation. The retired military intelligence officer was convinced police were incompetent. He grew his hair long, dressed like a hippie, and infiltrated the drug underworld of the Sunset Strip. For months, he haunted the places where dealers and users congregated, showing photos of his daughter, asking questions, following leads that went nowhere. His obsession worried his family, but grief had consumed him. The forensic evidence was puzzling. Multiple weapons had been used: knives, a gun, even a bayonet. The killer or killers had brought an arsenal, suggesting premeditation. But the attack patterns were chaotic, almost frenzied. Blood spatter analysis showed the victims had tried to run, had fought back, had been chased down and finished off. This wasn't the work of professional hitmen. It felt personal, emotional, uncontrolled. Detectives interviewed hundreds of people. Sharon's friends, Roman's colleagues, anyone who had been to parties at the house. They learned about the couple's complicated sex life, their experimentation with drugs, their connections to some of Hollywood's seedier characters. But every lead fizzled out. Every suspect had alibis. Every theory collapsed under scrutiny. The phone calls started pouring in from psychics, cranks, and attention seekers. Tips came from across the country claiming to have seen the killers, to know their identities, to have crucial information. Police followed up on everything, desperately hoping for a breakthrough. But the real killers remained invisible. Meanwhile, the Manson family was hiding in plain sight. Charles Tex Watson had actually been arrested in September 1969 for unrelated charges, just 1 month after the murders. But no one connected him to the Tate killings. The family members scattered to various communes and crash pads throughout California, laying low, waiting for the heat to die down. Pressure mounted from the media and public. How could 5 people be slaughtered in Beverly Hills without police finding a single legitimate suspect? Were the rich and famous really safe anywhere? Hollywood parties stopped. Celebrities hired bodyguards. A climate of fear settled over Los Angeles like a toxic fog. What police didn't know was that the killers had struck again just 24 hours after the Tate murders. On August 10th, Leno and Rosemary LaBianca had been butchered in their Los Feliz home with the same savage brutality. But the two crime scenes weren't connected yet. The LAPD and Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department weren't sharing information effectively. The left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing. By October 1969, the trail had gone completely cold. The Tate murders seemed destined to join the ranks of famous unsolved cases. The killers had vanished like ghosts, leaving behind only blood, terror, and a city that would never feel safe again. But in a county jail cell, a young woman named Susan Atkins was about to change everything. As the investigation dragged on, a disturbing picture of the victim's final days began to emerge. The perfect Hollywood lifestyle that Sharon Tate and her friends had projected publicly was masking a world of drugs, sexual experimentation, and dangerous connections that police were only beginning to understand. Jay Sebring wasn't just a celebrity hairstylist. He was a man with dark appetites. Police discovered his secret life of bondage and sadomasochism, his collection of whips and chains, his reputation for rough sex with both men and women. Some of Hollywood's biggest stars were his clients, but others were his sexual partners in increasingly dangerous games. Had one of these encounters gone too far? Had someone wanted revenge? The relationship between Sharon, Jay, and Roman was far more complex than anyone had realized. Jay had never gotten over losing Sharon to Roman, and she had never completely cut ties with her former lover. Phone records showed dozens of calls between them in the weeks before her death. Friends revealed that Jay had been pressuring Sharon to leave Roman, claiming the director was neglecting her and their unborn child. Wojciech Frykowski's drug dealing was more extensive than initially believed. He wasn't just selling party drugs to actors and musicians. He was connected to a network of dealers importing cocaine and heroin from Mexico and Canada. Financial records showed he owed significant money to dangerous people. His girlfriend Abigail Folger had been funding his operations with her family fortune, but the arrangement was falling apart. They'd been fighting constantly about money, drugs, and his infidelity. The most shocking revelation came from examining Sharon's own behavior in her final weeks. Despite being 8 months pregnant, she had been experimenting with LSD and other psychedelics. Friends were horrified to learn she'd been taking drugs that could harm her baby, but Sharon seemed increasingly disconnected from reality. She'd been having nightmares about death, talking obsessively about evil forces, and expressing paranoid fears that someone was watching the house. Roman's absence wasn't as innocent as it appeared either. He'd been having an affair with a 15-year-old girl in London, a fact that would later become public in his statutory rape scandal. Sharon knew about his infidelities but felt trapped by her pregnancy and her fear of being alone. Several friends reported that she'd been considering leaving Roman after the baby was born. The house at 11052 Cielo Drive had a dark history that preceded the murders. It had previously been rented by Terry Melcher, Doris Day's son and a record producer. Melcher had connections to some unsavory characters in the music business, including a small-time musician and ex-convict named Charles Manson, who had auditioned for him. But this connection wouldn't become clear for months. Stephen Parent, the innocent teenager who died in his car, wasn't as random a victim as initially believed. He'd been selling drugs to the caretaker William Garrettson and had been at the house several times before. Some investigators theorized he might have witnessed something or known something that made him a target. The timeline of the final evening was more disturbing than anyone realized. Dinner had been tense, with arguments between the couples. Jay Sebring had been drinking heavily and making aggressive advances towards Sharon. Frykowski was high on cocaine and becoming increasingly paranoid. Folger was threatening to cut off his drug money and leave him. By 10 p.m., when the killers arrived, the victims were already in emotional turmoil. Phone records revealed a series of mysterious calls to the house in the days before the murders. Someone had been calling and hanging up, or asking for people who didn't live there. Sharon had mentioned to friends that she felt like she was being watched, that strange cars had been seen in the neighborhood. The most chilling discovery was a list found in Sharon's handwriting, names of people she was afraid of. Most were dismissed as pregnancy-induced paranoia, but one name stood out, a reference to the creepy guy who came to see Terry about music. This cryptic note wouldn't make sense until much later, when police learned about Charles Manson's connection to Terry Melcher. Financial investigations revealed that several of the victims had received death threats or extortion attempts in the months before their murders. Jay Sebring had been threatened by the husband of a woman he was sleeping with. Frykowski had been warned by dealers that he needed to pay his debts or face consequences. Even Sharon had received strange letters from obsessed fans who knew intimate details about her daily routine. The autopsy results painted an even grimmer picture. The killers hadn't just murdered their victims, they had tortured them. Many of the wounds were inflicted after death, suggesting a level of rage and hatred that went beyond simple robbery or even drug-related violence. This was personal. This was ritualistic. This was the work of people who enjoyed causing pain and terror. As these dark secrets emerged, the investigation took on new urgency. This wasn't random violence. It was targeted brutality by people who knew their victims' vulnerabilities. But who could hate these people enough to butcher them so savagely? And why had they written pig in Sharon's blood? The answers were hiding in the desert, with a madman who believed he was Jesus Christ and a family of lost souls who would kill for his twisted love. The pressure to solve Hollywood's most shocking murders led investigators down countless dead ends, each more frustrating than the last. For months, the LAPD chased ghosts while the real killers walked free, sometimes in plain sight. The Black Panther investigation consumed enormous resources and destroyed innocent lives. Based solely on the word pig found at the crime scene, dozens of African-American activists were arrested on trumped-up charges just to bring them in for questioning about the murders. Police raided Panther headquarters, intercepted their communications, and treated every member as a potential mass murderer. The theory was racist and ridiculous. The Panthers were political revolutionaries, not random killers of pregnant movie stars. But it played into white fears about black rage in 1969 America. One particularly tragic case involved a young Panther named Julius Butler, who was arrested and beaten during interrogation about the Tate murders. Butler had a solid alibi. He'd been in jail on August 9th, but police held him for weeks anyway, trying to force a confession. The experience radicalized him further and contributed to his later involvement in violent crimes that had nothing to do with the original case. The drug connection led to an even bigger waste of time and resources. Police became obsessed with a mysterious Canadian drug dealer known only as Pick, who supposedly had connections to Wojciech Frykowski. They spent months tracking this phantom figure across North America, conducting raids in Vancouver, Montreal, and Toronto. The Canadian investigation involved multiple law enforcement agencies and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Pick turned out to be a small-time marijuana dealer with no connection to the murders whatsoever. Even more bizarre was the investigation into a supposed satanic cult operating in Los Angeles. After learning that Sharon Tate had appeared in a movie about witchcraft called Eye of the Devil, some detectives became convinced that devil worshippers had targeted her for ritual sacrifice. They raided occult bookstores, interrogated palm readers and tarot card readers, and investigated anyone who had ever shown interest in the supernatural. The satanic panic was decades ahead of schedule, but it consumed weeks of investigative time. Roman Polanski himself remained under suspicion far longer than was reasonable. His grief seemed too controlled to some detectives, his alibis too perfect. A team of investigators spent months in London, reconstructing every minute of his time there, interviewing restaurant staff, hotel clerks, and film crew members. They analyzed his phone calls, his credit card receipts, even his laundry bills. Some were convinced he'd hired professional killers to eliminate his wife and unborn child, perhaps to collect insurance money or to free himself for other relationships. The investigation revealed his affairs and his taste for very young women, but no connection to the murders. The most persistent false lead involved a mysterious hitchhiker who had allegedly been picked up near the Tate house on the night of the murders. Multiple witnesses claimed to have seen a long-haired young man with blood on his clothes walking along Benedict Canyon Road around midnight. Police created composite sketches and distributed them nationwide. Tips poured in from across the country. The bloody hitchhiker had been seen in Texas, Florida, New York, even Canada. Every lead was followed, every sighting investigated. The hitchhiker turned out to be a collective delusion, a product of mass hysteria and wishful thinking. William Garretson, the caretaker, remained under suspicion despite passing multiple polygraph tests. His story seemed impossible. How could anyone sleep through such a violent attack just yards away? Police repeatedly arrested and re-interviewed him, convinced he was either involved or knew more than he was saying. Garretson's life was destroyed by the constant harassment. He lost his job, his girlfriend left him, and he was forced to change his name and move across the country to escape the suspicion. A particularly cruel red herring involved Sharon Tate's father, Colonel Paul Tate. His secretive investigation into Hollywood's drug underworld made some police suspicious of his motives. Was his grief real, or was he covering up his own involvement? Some theorized that he discovered his daughter's drug use and taken extreme action to save her from corruption. The theory was absurd. Paul Tate was a decorated military officer who worshipped his daughter, but it persisted for months. The investigation was also hampered by celebrity culture and media interference. So many famous people had been to parties at the Cielo Drive house that the suspect list included some of the biggest names in Hollywood. Detectives spent countless hours interviewing A-list actors, directors, and musicians who had alibis but demanded kid glove treatment. Some celebrities hired private investigators to clear their names, creating parallel investigations that often interfered with official police work. Meanwhile, the real killers were living in communes and crash pads throughout Southern California, sometimes interacting with police without raising any suspicion. Charles Tex Watson was arrested in September 1969 for public drunkenness, just 1 month after the murders. Susan Atkins was picked up twice for minor drug offenses. But no one connected these hippie criminals to the sophisticated Beverly Hills massacre. The failure to connect the Tate murders with the LaBianca killings was perhaps the most costly mistake of all. The crimes had occurred just 24 hours apart, both involving multiple victims, excessive violence, and messages written in blood. But because they occurred in different jurisdictions, Beverly Hills versus Los Angeles County, information wasn't shared effectively. If detectives had realized they were looking for the same killers, the investigation might have taken a very different direction. By December 1969, the official investigation was essentially dead in the water. Police had interviewed over 8,000 suspects, followed up on 300 tips, and spent hundreds of thousands of dollars without solving anything. The public was losing faith in law enforcement's ability to protect them. Politicians were calling for federal intervention. The killers seemed to have committed the perfect crime. But sometimes the perfect crime unravels because criminals can't resist bragging about their perfect crime. And in a women's prison in Los Angeles, Susan Atkins was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. The break in the Tate LaBianca case came from the last place anyone expected: a women's jail cell where a young hippie was bragging about murder to anyone who would listen. Susan Atkins had been arrested in October 1969 during a raid on Barker Ranch in Death Valley, along with Charles Manson and several other family members. They were charged with auto theft and arson, minor crimes that should have meant quick release. But Atkins had a mouth that wouldn't quit, and she was about to confess to the most notorious unsolved murders in American history. Virginia Graham was Atkins's first cellmate at Sybil Brand Institute, a tough ex-prostitute doing time for petty theft. She'd heard every con story, every tough girl fantasy, every lie that desperate women told to seem important. So when this scrawny hippie girl started talking about killing people, Graham figured it was just another jailhouse fantasy. But the details were too specific, too horrifying, too real. "You know that thing in Benedict Canyon?" Atkins whispered one night, referring to the Tate murders without naming them directly. "I was there. I did it." She described the house, the victims, details that hadn't been released to the public. She talked about stabbing a pregnant woman who begged for her baby's life. She bragged about drinking the victims' blood and tasting their flesh. Graham was horrified, but she was also smart enough to keep listening. When Atkins was transferred to another cell, she found herself bunking with Ronnie Howard, a savvy con artist who immediately recognized that her new cellmate was confessing to something huge. Howard encouraged Atkins to keep talking, to share more details, to trust her with the whole story. And Atkins, desperate for attention and approval, spilled everything. The story that emerged was beyond anyone's wildest imagination. Atkins described a hippie commune led by a charismatic ex-convict named Charles Manson, who convinced his followers that they were chosen to survive an apocalyptic race war. She detailed how Manson had sent her and 3 others to the Tate house with orders to destroy everyone and make it witchy. She explained how they'd tortured and killed 5 innocent people, then returned the next night to murder 2 more. Howard knew she was sitting on dynamite. When her lawyer visited, she insisted on speaking to police immediately. But the system moved slowly, and it took weeks before detectives Paul Whiteley and Charles Guenther finally interviewed Atkins in December 1969. What they heard changed everything. Atkins' confession was horrifyingly detailed and completely consistent with the crime scene evidence. She knew things that only the killers could know. The exact layout of the house, the positions of the bodies, the words Sharon Tate had spoken before she died. She described how Charles Tex Watson had shot Stephen Parent, how she had held Sharon Tate while Watson stabbed her, how they'd used the victim's blood to write "pig" on the front door. But the confession revealed something even more shocking. The Tate murders weren't random. Charles Manson had specifically chosen that house because he'd been there before, when it was rented by record producer Terry Melcher. Manson had auditioned for Melcher months earlier, hoping to launch a music career. When Melcher rejected him and then moved out without leaving a forwarding address, Manson felt humiliated and betrayed. The house became a symbol of Hollywood's rejection, and the people inside became targets for his revenge. Atkins also connected the Tate murders to the LaBianca killings for the first time. She described how Manson had driven the killers around Los Angeles the night after the Tate murders, looking for another house to hit. The LaBiancas were chosen completely at random. Manson had simply liked the look of their house in Los Feliz. The murders weren't about the victims at all. They were about creating terror and chaos to spark the race war that Manson called Helter Skelter. The revelation of Manson's ideology was perhaps most disturbing of all. He'd convinced his followers that the Beatles' White Album contained coded messages about an imminent race war between blacks and whites. After the blacks won, Manson taught they would be unable to govern themselves and would turn to him and his family for leadership. The murders were designed to make it look like black revolutionaries were killing wealthy whites, thereby accelerating the conflict. With Atkins' confession in hand, police moved quickly to arrest the other participants. Patricia Krenwinkel was picked up at her father's house in Alabama. Leslie Van Houten was found at a ranch in California. Charles Tex Watson fled to Texas and fought extradition for months. And Charles Manson himself was already in custody, held on the minor charges from the Death Valley raid. The arrest of Linda Kasabian, the fourth member of the Tate murder team, proved to be another crucial break. Unlike the others, Kasabian showed genuine remorse for what had happened. She'd been the getaway driver both nights, but hadn't actually killed anyone. Desperate to avoid the death penalty and protect her young children, she agreed to cooperate with prosecutors and testify against the others. Kasabian's testimony provided the final pieces of the puzzle. She described Manson's hold over his followers, the combination of drugs, sex, and psychological manipulation that turned middle-class teenagers into cold-blooded killers. She revealed how Manson had prepared them for murder with months of conditioning, gradually breaking down their normal moral inhibitions until they were capable of anything. The news that the Tate LaBianca murders had been solved sent shockwaves around the world, but the solution was almost more terrifying than the mystery had been. These weren't professional hitmen or rational criminals acting for understandable motives. They were brainwashed kids from good families who had killed for a madman's impossible dream of racial apocalypse. The hippie movement, already under attack from conservative politicians, suffered a devastating blow. The image of flower children spreading peace and love was replaced by the reality of Charles Manson's family spreading death and terror. The age of Aquarius was over before it had really begun. But even as the killers were identified and arrested, questions remained. How had Manson gained such complete control over his followers? Were there other murders the family had committed? And most disturbing of all, were there other Charles Mansons out there, building their own armies of devoted killers? The trial would answer some of these questions, but it would also reveal that the nightmare was far from over. December 9th, 1969, was the day Charles Manson finally came face to face with justice, and the day America got its first real look at the monster behind the murders. When detectives arrived at the Los Angeles County Jail to formally charge him with 7 counts of first-degree murder, Manson's reaction wasn't fear or denial. It was a smile that would haunt everyone who saw it. "I've never killed anyone," Manson said, still grinning. "I don't need to kill anyone. I think it with my mind." Even confronted with overwhelming evidence, he refused to take responsibility for the carnage his followers had carried out. In his twisted logic, He was innocent because he hadn't personally wielded the knives or pulled the triggers. He'd simply planted ideas in fertile minds and watched them grow into something beautiful and terrible. The interrogation of Charles Manson was unlike anything veteran detectives had ever experienced. For 12 hours, they tried to break through his layers of manipulation, philosophy, and outright insanity. Manson spoke in riddles and song lyrics, quoted the Bible and the Beatles with equal fervor, and maintained an eerie calm that unnerved even the most hardened cops. "You people don't understand," he told Detective Paul Whiteley. "I am you. Everything you've done through me. I'm just a mirror reflecting your society. You made me what I am, and now you want to destroy me for showing you the truth." It was classic Manson, deflecting blame while positioning himself as both victim and prophet. When asked about Sharon Tate's final moments, when she begged for her unborn baby's life, Manson's response was chilling. "She should have been grateful. We gave her and her baby eternal life. Death is just another beginning." The complete lack of empathy or remorse in his voice made it clear that this wasn't an ordinary criminal. This was a true sociopath who saw murder as a form of religious sacrament. Charles Tex Watson's arrest in Texas provided another piece of the puzzle. The former college football player and honor student had transformed into Manson's most willing executioner, personally responsible for most of the actual killings. When Texas Rangers arrested him at his family's home, Watson was incoherent, mumbling about Helter Skelter and insisting that he'd been chosen by God to start a holy war. Watson's confession was even more detailed than Susan Atkins and far more disturbing. He described the murders with an enthusiasm that sickened investigators. He talked about how it felt to stab people, how their blood looked in the moonlight, how their screams sounded like music. The clean-cut boy from a good Christian family had become something inhuman under Manson's influence. Patricia Krenwinkel's capture in Alabama revealed the national scope of Manson's reach. She'd fled across the country, but couldn't escape the guilt of what she'd done. When FBI agents found her hiding in her father's trailer, she was emaciated, paranoid, and covered in self-inflicted cuts. She'd been carving X's into her skin, copying the symbol Manson had carved into his own forehead while in jail. Krenwinkel's confession filled in the horrifying details of Abigail Folger's final moments. She described chasing the coffee heiress through the house and out onto the lawn, stabbing her over and over as Folger begged for her life. "I kept stabbing and stabbing until she stopped moving," Krenwinkel said matter-of-factly. Charlie said we had to make sure they were all dead. Leslie Van Houten, the youngest of the killers at just 19, provided the most insight into Manson's psychological control techniques. She'd been a homecoming princess and honor student before joining the family, but months of isolation, drug use, and constant indoctrination had turned her into a willing participant in the LaBianca murders. Her confession revealed how Manson had gradually broken down her normal moral boundaries until murder seemed not just acceptable, but necessary. "Charlie taught us that death wasn't real," Van Houten explained to shocked detectives. "He said we were just helping people move from one plane of existence to another. The LaBiancas should thank us for freeing them from their bourgeois prison." The complete inversion of normal moral values showed the depth of Manson's psychological manipulation. The most crucial confession came from Linda Kasabian, the family member who'd driven the killers to both crime scenes but hadn't actually participated in the murders. Desperate to protect her children and genuinely horrified by what she'd witnessed, Kasabian agreed to testify for the prosecution in exchange for immunity. Kasabian's account of the Tate murders was heartbreaking in its detail. She described how Sharon Tate had cried out for her mother as she died, how Jay Sebring had tried to shield her from the knives, how Abigail Folger had almost escaped before being dragged back and butchered. Most disturbing of all, she revealed that Atkins had tasted Sharon Tate's blood and used it to write "pig" on the front door. But perhaps the most shocking revelation was how close the killers had come to striking again. Kasabian described how Manson had wanted to commit more murders, to keep the killing spree going until the country erupted in racial violence. Only the arrest of family members on unrelated charges had prevented additional massacres. The confessions also revealed the true scope of Manson's criminal empire. The family hadn't just committed the Tate LaBianca murders. They'd been involved in numerous other crimes, including drug dealing, auto theft, credit card fraud, and possibly additional murders that were never solved. Manson had created an entire criminal organization dedicated to preparing for his prophesied race war. As news of the arrests and confessions spread, the reaction was swift and overwhelming. Hollywood celebrities who dismissed the murders as random violence suddenly realized how close they'd come to being targets themselves. Many had known Terry Melcher, the record producer whose rejection of Manson had triggered the killing spree. They understood that it could have been any of them bleeding out on their living room floors. The hippie community went into denial and then defensive mode. How could their movement of peace and love have produced such monsters? Some blamed the media for sensationalizing the story. Others claimed Manson wasn't a real hippie, but a government agent sent to discredit the counterculture. The truth that their movement had attracted and enabled a psychopath was too painful for many to accept. But the most chilling aspect of the confessions was how normal the killers seemed. These weren't obviously deranged individuals. They were attractive young people from middle-class families who'd somehow been transformed into instruments of murder. If it could happen to them, it could happen to anyone's children. The stage was now set for what would become known as the trial of the century, a legal circus that would expose the full horror of Manson's twisted philosophy and forever change how America viewed crime, punishment, and the dark potential lurking within ordinary people. June 15, 1970, marked the beginning of what would become one of the most bizarre and captivating trials in American history. The Los Angeles County Courthouse became a circus as Charles Manson and his co-defendants, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten, faced justice for the brutal murders that had terrified a nation. From the very first day, Manson turned the courtroom into his personal stage. He arrived with an X carved into his forehead, claiming it represented his excommunication from society. When Judge Charles Older tried to maintain order, Manson leaped over the defense table, lunging toward the bench with a sharpened pencil while screaming, "In the name of Christian justice, someone should cut your head off!" It took 6 bailiffs to restrain him, and the incident set the tone for 9 months of chaos. Prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi faced an unprecedented challenge, proving that Manson had committed murder without ever touching a weapon. The case hinged on the legal theory of conspiracy, that Manson had directed and controlled the killers, even though he wasn't physically present at either crime scene. It was a complex argument that required jurors to understand the psychological hold Manson had over his followers. The prosecution's star witness was Linda Kasabian, the family member who'd driven the killers to both houses but hadn't participated in the actual murders. For 18 days, she described in excruciating detail how Manson had prepared his followers for murder through months of psychological conditioning. She revealed how he'd used LSD to break down their resistance, isolated them from their families, and gradually convinced them that killing was not only acceptable but necessary to start his prophesied race war. Kasabian's testimony was devastating. She described Sharon Tate's final words, "Please don't kill me. I just want to have my baby," and how Susan Atkins had shown no mercy. She recounted the systematic butchery of all 5 victims at Cielo Drive, then the random selection and murder of the LaBiancas the following night. Her calm, detailed recollections stood in stark contrast to the defendants' bizarre courtroom antics. The 3 female defendants, Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten, remained completely devoted to Manson throughout the trial. They shaved their heads when he did, carved X's into their foreheads when he did, and disrupted proceedings whenever he signaled them to do so. When Atkins was on the witness stand, she shocked the courtroom by declaring, "I have no mercy for Sharon Tate," and claiming she'd felt nothing while stabbing the pregnant actress. Outside the courthouse, remaining family members kept a vigil of support for their imprisoned leader. Lynette Squeaky Fromm and other followers camped on the sidewalk, chanting and holding signs proclaiming Manson's innocence. They shaved their heads, carved X's into their foreheads, and threatened anyone who spoke against their father. Their presence served as a chilling reminder that Manson's influence extended far beyond the defendants on trial. The defense strategy was virtually non-existent. The court-appointed lawyers struggled with clients who refused to cooperate, constantly fired them, and seemed more interested in creating chaos than mounting a legitimate defense. Manson eventually chose to represent himself, using the opportunity to deliver rambling monologues about society's corruption and his role as a truth-teller. In his final statement to the jury, Manson delivered an hour-long speech that perfectly captured his twisted worldview. "I accept this court as my father. I have always been in your jail. I have lived in your world of illusion. You made your children what they are. These children that come at you with knives, they are your children. You taught them." Even facing death, he refused to accept responsibility for his actions. The prosecution's closing argument methodically dismantled Manson's attempts to avoid responsibility. Bugliosi demonstrated how Manson had carefully selected and conditioned his followers, how he'd planned the murders to spark racial conflict, and how his control over the killers was absolute. The evidence was overwhelming. Testimony from multiple witnesses, physical evidence linking the defendants to the crimes, and the defendants' own confessions. On January 25, 1971, after deliberating for 42 hours over 7 days, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts. Charles Manson was convicted of 7 murders, 5 at the Tate house and 2 at the LaBianca house, despite never personally killing anyone. Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten were also convicted of multiple murder counts. The penalty phase was equally dramatic. The prosecution argued that the death penalty was the only appropriate punishment for such heinous crimes. The defense, such as it was, could offer little mitigation. The defendants had shown no remorse, continued to worship their leader, and posed an ongoing threat to society. On March 29, 1971, the same jury that had convicted the defendants sentenced all 4 to death in California's gas chamber. Judge Older, in pronouncing the sentences, called the crimes among the most shocking, heinous, and cruel ever committed in this state. The courtroom erupted in chaos as the defendants laughed and sang, completely unmoved by their death sentences. Charles Tex Watson was tried separately after fighting extradition from Texas for months. His trial in 1971 resulted in the same outcome, conviction on 7 murder counts and a death sentence. The legal system had finally delivered justice for the victims of Manson's twisted vision. But the story didn't end with the verdicts. In 1972, the California Supreme Court temporarily abolished the death penalty, automatically commuting all death sentences to life imprisonment. The killers who should have paid with their lives would instead spend decades in prison, repeatedly seeking parole and forcing the victims' families to relive their trauma over and over again. The trial had accomplished more than just delivering justice. It had exposed the dark underbelly of the 1960s counterculture and forever changed how America viewed crime and punishment. The image of flower children spreading peace and love was replaced by the reality of Manson's followers spreading death and terror. The Manson murders didn't just end lives. They shattered an entire era of American innocence. More than 50 years later, the ripple effects of those 2 nights in August 1969 continue to shape how we live, how we trust, and how we protect ourselves. But the most chilling part? Some of those effects are ones Charlie Manson himself would have smiled about. Hollywood was never the same after Cielo Drive. Within weeks of the murders, A-list celebrities were installing panic rooms, hiring round-the-clock security, and moving into gated compounds that resembled military installations more than homes. Steve McQueen, a friend of Jay Sebring, started carrying a gun everywhere. He'd been invited to Sharon Tate's house that very night, but had gotten lucky with a last-minute date. The near miss haunted him for years. Mia Farrow, another close friend, fled Los Angeles entirely, convinced that the killers would come for her next. Frank Sinatra hired bodyguards for the first time in his career. The carefree party culture of the 1960s was replaced overnight by paranoia and fortress mentality. The physical house at 1050 Cielo Drive became Hollywood's most infamous address, a place so tainted that it seemed to carry a curse. The property changed hands multiple times, with each owner struggling against the dark magnetism of its history. One owner tried renting it out, only to have tenants flee after just days, claiming they heard screaming at night. Another attempted to capitalize on the notoriety by giving tours, until neighbors and police shut it down. The breaking point came when Trent Reznor of 9 Inch Nails rented the house in the 1990s and recorded an album there, naming his studio Pig. The very word Manson's followers had scrawled in Sharon's blood. Reznor later admitted he felt uncomfortable there and moved out before his lease expired. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. Even demolished and rebuilt with a new address, the property continues to attract dark tourists and Manson obsessives. Real estate agents still struggle to sell it, and neighbors report strange visitors taking photos and leaving flowers, not for the victims, but for Charlie. The new house, built in 1994, has sold for millions below market value multiple times. Current residents have installed high-tech security systems and refuse to give their address to delivery services, terrified that the Manson connection will bring danger to their door. The Tate family's fight for justice became a decades-long crusade that changed American law forever. Doris Tate, Sharon's mother, transformed her grief into a relentless campaign for victims' rights. She was among the first to demand that victims' families have a voice in parole hearings, a concept that didn't exist before Manson. Her appearances at parole hearings became legendary. Facing Susan Atkins in 1985, she declared, "I have tortured myself with the knowledge that your victim pleaded for her life and that of her unborn child, and you said you had no mercy for her." Atkins was denied parole. When facing Patricia Krenwinkel, Doris brought enlarged crime scene photos and forced the parole board to look at what had been done to her daughter. When Doris died in 1992, her daughter Deborah picked up the torch. She's attended every single parole hearing for the surviving killers, over 40 appearances spanning 3 decades. Her dedication is both inspiring and heartbreaking, a life consumed by ensuring that her sister's killers never taste freedom again. Deborah has memorized every detail of the crime, studied every piece of evidence, and can recite the killer's prison records from memory. But here's the twist that would make Charlie laugh. In fighting his followers, she's become forever connected to him. Her entire adult life has been defined by his evil. The impact on America's justice system was revolutionary. The concept of victim impact statements, now standard in courtrooms nationwide, was born from the Manson case. California overhauled its parole system, partly because of public outrage that these killers might someday walk free. The legal principle that someone could be convicted of murder without personally wielding the weapon, holding Manson responsible for deaths he didn't directly cause, set precedents still used in gang and conspiracy cases today. The case also sparked the creation of specialized cult investigation units in law enforcement agencies across the country. But perhaps Manson's most sinister victory was cultural. The hippie movement, which had promised peace and love, became forever associated with violence and chaos. Parents across America pointed to Manson when forbidding their children from joining communes or dropping out to find themselves. The counterculture that had challenged authority and traditional values was suddenly seen as a pipeline to murder. Nixon and conservative politicians exploited this fear brilliantly, turning law and order into a winning campaign strategy that persists today. The Manson murders became the poster child for everything wrong with the permissive 1960s. The psychological impact ran even deeper. Before Manson, random violence was something that happened to other people in other places. The fact that beautiful, wealthy people could be slaughtered in their own homes by strangers shattered the illusion of safety that money and status provided. Suddenly, everyone was vulnerable. This paranoia birthed the modern security industry. Home alarm systems, gated communities, and private protection services all exploded in popularity after 1969. The average American home went from having one lock to multiple deadbolts, security cameras, and motion detectors. Universities began studying the Manson case as the definitive example of cult psychology and mind control. The techniques Charlie used, isolation, sleep deprivation, sexual manipulation, and constant reinforcement of his ideology, became the blueprint for understanding how ordinary people could be turned into killers. These studies proved crucial in later cases involving cults like Jim Jones's People's Temple and David Koresh's Branch Davidians. FBI profilers still reference Manson's methods when investigating modern cult leaders and domestic terrorists. In popular culture, Manson achieved a twisted form of immortality. His face appeared on magazine covers more than some presidents. Hollywood produced dozens of films about him, often glamorizing or mythologizing his story in ways that would have fed his narcissistic hunger for attention. He received thousands of love letters in prison, marriage proposals from disturbed women, and even recorded albums of his songs. The man who claimed to be a mirror reflecting society's darkness had successfully created a dark reflection that society couldn't stop staring at. Books about him consistently topped bestseller lists. Documentaries about him drew massive audiences, and his prison interviews became viral content decades before the internet existed. The strangest legacy might be the continued devotion of Manson followers. Even today, decades after his death, websites and social media groups celebrate his teachings. Young people, born long after the murders, discover his rambling interviews and prison letters online, finding in his anti-establishment message something that speaks to their own alienation. It's a chilling reminder that the ideas that created one monster can create others. Some maintain shrines to him, collect his artwork and letters, and even make pilgrimages to locations associated with the murders. The surviving family members took wildly different paths. Charles Tex Watson found religion in prison and became an ordained minister, counseling other inmates. He's been denied parole 18 times, but continues to claim he's been reborn in Christ. Patricia Krenwinkel, now in her 70s, has been denied parole 14 times. She's become a model prisoner, earning college degrees and helping other inmates, but the parole board consistently rules that her crimes were too heinous for release. Leslie Van Houten was finally paroled in 2023 after 53 years behind bars, sparking outrage from victims' rights groups who argued that murder should mean life without possibility of parole. Susan Atkins died in prison in 2009, still expressing loyalty to Manson until the end, though she later claimed to have found God. Lynette Squeaky Fromm, who wasn't involved in the murders but remained devoted to Manson, attempted to assassinate President Gerald Ford in 1975 and served 34 years in prison. She was released in 2009 and reportedly still defends Manson's actions. Other family members scattered across the country, some changing their identities completely, others embracing their dark fame. But the most disturbing legacy is this: Manson succeeded in ways he never imagined. He wanted to start a race war and bring down the establishment. He failed at the first but partially succeeded at the second. The trust, openness, and optimism that characterized American society in the 1960s died with Sharon Tate and the others. We became a more fearful, suspicious, and divided society. We locked our doors, installed security systems, and stopped talking to strangers. The communal spirit that had defined the counterculture was replaced by isolation and mistrust. Every time a gated community goes up, every time parents refuse to let their children walk alone, every time we choose suspicion over trust, Charlie wins a little. The man who preached about society's corruption successfully corrupted society's faith in itself. He died in prison at age 83 in November 2017, but his toxic legacy lives on in the walls we build, the fears we carry, and the darkness we've allowed into our national soul. Even his death couldn't bring closure. Multiple people claimed his body, leading to a bizarre legal battle over who had the right to his remains. Some wanted to bury him quietly, others wanted to profit from his notoriety. The fight lasted months, with lawyers arguing over the corpse of a man who had spent 47 years behind bars. The most chilling thought of all? Somewhere out there, another lost soul might be reading Manson's words, watching his interviews, and thinking they've found their answer to the world's problems. The monster is dead, but the seeds he planted keep growing in the dark corners of society, waiting for the right conditions to bloom again. Social media has made his toxic philosophy more accessible than ever, reaching vulnerable minds across the globe with just a few clicks. Modern mass killers often reference Manson in their manifestos. School shooters have quoted his prison interviews. Domestic terrorists have adopted his tactics of targeting symbols of American prosperity and innocence. The line from Charles Manson to modern American violence is straight and unbroken, a poisonous thread running through 50 years of tragedy. That's the true horror of the Manson murders. Not just what happened on those August nights in 1969, but what we became because of them. We live in the world Charlie Manson helped create. More fearful, more isolated, more suspicious of our neighbors and ourselves. And Charlie, wherever his spirit resides, is probably still smiling about that. His greatest victory wasn't the murders themselves. It was convincing an entire society that such evil could be lurking anywhere, in anyone, at any time. In the end, he didn't need to start Helter Skelter. He just needed to make us believe it was already here.